This week's Common Sense Award goes to France. This week they instituted what's being called in the U.S. media a super tax! Oh my god, run for the hills! Just calm down. Alright, so what is it? What is this super tax? It's a temporary 75% tax on the super rich. Now, I know everybody's head is exploding, like, how can a 75% tax make sense? Well, let me explain. The common understanding of this, of what the tax is, was expressed in a comment I came across on Twitter. The source I won't mention. But he said, quote, 75% tax on what you earn in 1 year. Now you go make $1 million and give $750,000 to the government, then you can talk. And that's just flat out not correct. That would be insane. Nobody is in favor of that. And what this tax is in reality is that your first $1,285,200 is taxed at the normal rate, which can be anywhere from nothing to 45% in France. And in the US, it could be anywhere from nothing to 35%, depending on how you earn your income and some other factors. And everything over that $1,285,200 number is annually taxed at 75%. This is what we call a marginal income tax rate. And it's called that because it only affects the margins of income earners. It's also important to mention that if France is anything like the United States, this number of 75% is pre-deductions, pre-loopholes, pre-special tax breaks for various reasons. So the effective rate is much lower. Now look, if somebody wants to have a discussion about where to draw the lines and institute this kind of tax, that certainly is a discussion worth having. Maybe it makes more sense to draw the line at 2 million or 3 million or even 4 million or even higher, right? But to put it in perspective, earning $1.5 million annually in the US would mean you're in the top 1/10 of 1% of income earners. So that means 99.9% of the population makes less than you. So why did they do this? Well, mainly to slash their budget deficit and increase savings without hitting the purchasing power of low and middle income families. Critics argue that the so-called job creators are going to get up and leave France because of this, but the reality is that a handful will, but certainly not any statistically significant number, and many modern countries throughout history have instituted taxes like this before, with not only no net negative effects, in fact, it actually leads to economic expansion and job creation. If you don't believe me, just take the US for example. In what's called the golden age of economic expansion in the US, which was roughly the late 1940s to the late 1960s, the marginal income tax rate pre-deductions was between 70% and 94%. This actually incentivized business owners to keep capital in their businesses and expand their businesses instead of taking it out, because then if they took it out, they'd be taxed. So it's actually fascinating because at face value, you wouldn't think that a high marginal income tax rate makes sense and leads to a robust expanding economy. It's very counterintuitive, but it actually does lead to that. So if you look at the historical evidence, to not see the parallels between a high marginal income tax rate and a good economy, you'd have to have a cinder block for a head. The effective tax rate at this time also is important to note that it's lower in reality. So it was like 43% in the US when the marginal income tax rate was between 70 and 94%. But that's still much higher than the 35% rate we have today. And again, the effective rate is much lower. And you can even see this trend in recent history too. President Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President George W. Bush had disastrous deficits. Clinton's marginal income tax rate was higher, and he was the only U.S. president in recent history to balance the budget and leave a surplus. I mean, it's certainly due to a mix of factors, including the technology boom under Clinton, but the tax rate kept the government books in order and funded necessary popular government programs. For the record, I do think 75% is too high a tax, and I do think you need to cut government spending and programs where you can find things that don't work and you can find waste, fraud, and abuse. But you also need to raise revenue, and you need to raise them from the right people. In the US, the top 1% have reaped all the benefits in modern society. Middle class productivity has been rising steadily since 1980, but wages have been stagnant. And the richest 1% now have more financial wealth than the bottom 95% combined. So for sticking with the model to address deficit issues and a stagnating economy properly, despite the world wrongly criticizing them, this week's Common Sense Award goes to France.